thank you very much to the Politics and International Studies group for inviting me to speak at Aberdeen. It's a real pleasure. It's going to be a bit of a bumpy ride out, I think, tomorrow with the wind blowing, because it's always so windy here. Got a big giant hedge backwards all day. I'm going to talk tonight. It's going to be a talk in two halves. First of all, discussing what it's like to actually be recruited and to work in British intelligence. And then we'll have a bit of time for some questions. And then we'll move on to what it's like to take the decision to become a whistleblower. And that means throwing up your job, facing prison, and having to go on the run, literally around Europe, which is what I and my former partner did back in 1997. So I suppose you could say that we're the sort of analog generation of Edward Snowden. In fact, I think he's probably the only other intelligence official who has preemptively gone on the run before his story appeared in the media. So I have some sympathy for the man. But to start off, I'm going to take you back into the depths of history. How many of you want to be a spy, or think it would be cool to be a spy? A few. There's always a few. There's always a few. I'm going to ask you the same question at the end. So, just to give you a bit of background, in the UK we have a very British historic mess, pretty much as we have a very British historic mess in most of our public institutions, but particularly when it comes to the intelligence agencies. How many key intelligence agencies do you think there are in the UK? Three. 5. Well, isn't it? That would be MI7. There's actually 4 these days, because we have a sort of equivalence with the US setup. So for the CIA, we have MI6, otherwise known officially as the Secret Intelligence Service, which is the sort of James Bond wing of foreign intelligence gathering. Then we have the NSA equivalent, which is GCHQ, the Government Communications Headquarters, which used to be the very, very secret agency, but thanks to Mr. Snowden, has been forced out of the shadows, kicking and screaming. Then we have the equivalent of the FBI, Domestic Security Service. And in the past, everyone used to say the equivalence was MI5, of course. But in fact, it's not. The equivalence now is the 4th of the key intelligence agencies in the UK. And that is fairly new. It's called the National Crime Agency. And that is there to investigate serious international organised crime and terrorism. And they have executive powers, like the police, which means they can effect arrests. So those are our sort of equivalents with the American agencies. So I was wondering, where does that leave MI5, the old UK Domestic Security Service, and my former employers? Well, I have to say, looking more and more at their work, I'm seeing an increasing equivalent to the East German Stasi, the secret police. And allow me to develop that theme a little later. So we have a situation where, for 100 years, we've had MI5, MI6, and GCHQ. Now we have the NCA. And they were set up before the First World War to counter German espionage attempts. And they had a pretty good war. They also had a very good war during World War II. But unfortunately, things started to go a bit wrong after that, particularly because MI6 was massively penetrated up to senior levels by the KGB, the Russian intelligence agencies. There was a very notorious Cambridge spy ring, which was exposed in the 50s and 60s. And this caused massive embarrassment, because MI6 had been penetrated and MI5 hadn't seen it happening. But also, it caused massive paranoia at the upper echelons of British establishment. How on earth could our chaps betray their country in this way? How on earth could our chaps get away with it for so long? So suddenly there was this huge panic about Reds under the bed and secret communists infiltrating the British establishment. And that led to a real paranoid overreaction on the part of MI5 particularly, because they decided that they had to investigate all subversives, all people who might be subverted to work for Russia. Now this led to a huge investigation, looking at millions of citizens over the years, over the decades, for their political affiliations. Now, you could sort of see there was a sort of justification to investigate people who might be supportive of communism or members of the Communist Party. But this, of course, involved mission creep, and it spread out and out and out to involve the tiniest of Trotskyist splinter groups, the tiniest of left-wing activist groups. So eventually, I think they had about 1 million files held on British citizens purely for their political beliefs. And particularly in this case, you didn't have to have political beliefs to get a file. So you could just be a friend of, a query sympathiser of the Communist Party, and Bob's your uncle, you would have a file held in MI5 on you, which would be there for the rest of your life. Anyway, this is sort of very British muddle evolved on. Now, fast forward a little bit to the Cold War. The whole justification for this invasive, Stasi-like surveillance of British citizens. And the Cold War finished. We've just celebrated the fall of the Berlin Wall in Berlin last week. It was fabulous, great party. And we have a situation suddenly where MI5 and MI6 no longer have their primary justification for the work they've been doing. And they have to scrabble around looking for new work. So suddenly, the politicians decide that the right answer would be to give them primacy for terrorist work in the UK. Even though terrorism is a crime, even though back in the glory days of the 1990s, you investigated that crime and you gathered evidence and you put the suspects on trial in front of a jury of their peers. Now, of course, we just snatched them and disappeared them off to a black prison site, but back in the 90s, the law was vaguely upheld. And yet, MI5 was not equipped to do this. They were intelligence officers. They worked with secret information only. They did not know due process, procedure, and evidence gathering. So it's a very messy fit. But they were given that work anyway because they'd always existed. So they were always going to exist. And this is a very British muddle, and I think has led to the mess we currently find ourselves in, with the unconstitutionality of a lot of the work that they now seem to be involved in the war on terror. I'll get back to that later. The other historic bit I just want to draw your attention to is the dull old law, because it does have a bearing on my story. So the intelligence agency has been around for 105 years now. For the first 80 years of their existence, they didn't actually officially exist. So none of our MPs could ask questions, their budgets were off the books, everything they did was completely unaccountable and completely secret. Now, going back to the 1980s, there was a whole series of whistleblowing scandals, particularly and most notoriously a man called Peter Wright, who had been a former senior MI5 officer who wrote a book called Spy Catcher. You may have heard of it. This, the British government tried to ban across the world, and this the British government failed to ban, which set a lovely precedent for future whistleblowers. Because of these scandals, they decided to update the laws of the land to govern the intelligence agencies. Up until that point, the only law that was in place was something called the 1911 Official Secrets Act. Now, that was put in place to prosecute traitors who betray their country to an enemy power. And if you were caught betraying your country, you got 14 years in prison minimum. Some traitors got up to 42 years in prison. Now, because of the whistleblowing scandals in the 1980s, they updated this law. They put in place another one called the 1989 OSA. Now, this was put in place after the whistleblowers precisely to prevent whistleblowing. The old act is still on the books, it can still be used against traitors, but the new act is there to stifle dissent. And I say this because the key section under it is section 1.1, which governs intelligence whistleblowers and those notified about intelligence at the top echelons of government. And this says, if you talk to anyone outside your agency about your work ever, you will become the criminal de facto. You will go to prison for at least 2 years. In the same year, though, they also put in place something called the Security Service Act, which was there to govern MI5 and put it on a legal footing for the very first time, to give it some notion of accountability and some framework of law within which it should work in order to be proportionate within a democracy. And then in 1994, the third key act was the Intelligence Services Act, which covered GCHQ and MI6. And this did the same for them. They basically said, these are the laws. If you want to do something which would otherwise be illegal, you have to get the prior written permission from your political master, the Foreign Secretary for them, the Home Secretary for MI5. Crucially as well, the 94 Act put in place in Parliament something called the Intelligence and Security Committee. Now this has been in the news a lot over the last year. So Malcolm Rifkind, who is the chair of it, has been strutting around saying, oh, you know, it doesn't matter what Edward Snowden said GCHQ was doing. I know that they're obeying the law. It's all okay, trust us. So the Intelligence and Security Committee was supposed to be in there to act as a brake, to put some accountability in place for the spies. Unfortunately, they have woefully failed in the last 20 years to do any such thing. So that's the sort of background. In terms of my personal story, it's quite personal because I sort of fell into spying by accident. In fact, in those days, pretty much everybody did. If you wanted to be a spy, you would be the last person they chose. So I actually applied to the Foreign Office in 1990 And I quite fancied the job of a diplomat, you can sort of swan around embassy parties drinking champagne or whatever. Although actually the reality is, if you're lucky, you get a plastic glass of cheap plonk in an office. But that's a different story. So I applied to the Foreign Office, and I had a letter through the post on Ministry of Defence notepaper saying, mysteriously, it was one paragraph, there may be other jobs you would find more interesting. If you are interested, call this number. Now, I don't know why. My very first gut instinct was, and I said this out loud, unfortunately, hence all the problems ever after. My first instinct when I read it was, oh fuck, it's MI5. My usual ladylike manner. And I was going to ignore it because, actually, I thought the Spies sounded appalling. Because of all the whistleblowing scandals, they had a stinking reputation at the end of the 1980s. And also, I'd seen things like John le Carre, and I just thought, Christ, that world looks really bleak and grey and horrible and cold. Why on earth would anyone want to get involved? Unfortunately, as I said, I articulated my ladylike thoughts, and my father was in the room next to me when I opened the letter. Unfortunately, my father was a huge spy buff. He loved John le Carre, all that sort of stuff. And crucially, he was also an investigative journalist. So you can imagine his response was, oh, go on, just ring them up, see if it's MI5, please. So it's always good, you can always blame your parents later in life when things go tits up, I find. So I rang the number, and they said nothing apart from, we'd be interested in having a chat with you, can you come over to London? So I flew over about a week later, and had a 3-hour interview in this unmarked, empty office building in the centre of London. And it was really surreal, because for the first half of this interview, I was being grilled about my life from the age of 12. I mean, things like, what were my politics, what were my ethics, what were my hobbies, all that sort of thing, from 12. Oh God, I had trouble remembering even then. So this went on, and about halfway through the interview, my interrogator said, why do you think you're here? And I said, you MI5? I've got this wrong, and it looks so stupid. And she said, yes, we are. To continue this interview, please sign here. And that was that. That was my signature on the official notification of the terms of the Official Secrets Act, making it a crime to talk to anyone ever after about anything I might learn from then that point on. And it was like crossing the Rubicon, but it was just done so fast, it didn't really sink in at the time. By now I was thoroughly intrigued, because this woman was not what you would expect a spy to look like. She was a hippie. I kid you not. And she was lovely. I worked with her afterwards. She was really great. But she had, straight hair down to her bottom, and she wore these big sort of tiered, flowy, hippie belly skirts and things. And that was sort of quite reassuring from my point of view, because it just so unexpected, it piqued my interest. Anyway, I went through this interview, and I was quite surprised to get through to the next phase, which in those days was something called the Civil Service Selection Board, CSB, which is a notorious process, very painful to go through, of 2 days. And this is where you have to compete with other candidates and go through, oh God, piles of paper exercises and psychometric tests and interviews and role-play exercises. And then you have interviews with senior spooks and senior Home Office people and psychiatrists and all the rest of it. It goes on and on and on. It's really exhausting. And I was honest all the way through this process. I was honest all the way through the whole recruitment process about what my ethical stance was, which has not shifted much to this day. I remember interminable arguments about the issue of internment of terrorist suspects without trial. No. Of torture? No. I hadn't changed. And they kept saying to me, come back to the next stage. I was really surprised they kept re-inviting me back. And they kept reassuring me and saying, don't believe what you read in the newspapers. We don't get involved in this stuff. We're good guys. We have to obey the law because we've got the SSA and the OSA and all the other A's hanging around. So I was quite reassured by this. And they said that also they were looking for a new generation of intelligence officer. This is 1990, remember, so even MI5 had twigged that the Berlin Wall had come down and there was no more Cold War. So they knew they were taking on this new terrorist work. They wanted a new generation of officers to work on these fast-paced terrorist investigations. So this all sounded quite good, quite reassuring, They had to obey the law, they were going after the baddies, I kept getting through. It was a very seductive process of being seduced into this charmed world, this secret world. The process went on for 10 months. There was a final selection board as well, and then of course there was the ghastly vetting to the highest degree, which is an interesting process in itself, because here they want to find out everything about you, of course. And they send someone to interview you, me, and they come to your home to see what your home is like. And I had this really strange little old lady. She looked like Mrs. Tiddlywinkle, you know, little granny figure, until you looked into her eyes, and they were cold as ice. And she sat there and she grilled me about things like, not only my politics, but my sexuality, you know, partners and lesbianism and all that sort of stuff. And it's really disconcerting when you're 21 to be grilled by a sort of maternal granny figure about stuff like that. Anyway, so I got through all that. And then they asked for nominations of 4 friends from different phases of your life, school, university, work, whatever. And they go and interview those friends in the same way. And then they ask those friends for 4 more referees, and they go and interview those people too. So they have a pretty fair idea of what you're all about by the time they get you. Anyway, after all this, I was thoroughly intrigued and actually really excited, thinking, great, this is going to be a fabulous job. And I walked into MI5 in January 1991, knowing nothing more at this point than the grade I was going into, which was meaningless to me, and how much money I was going to be earning. Which was crap, actually. You don't go into intelligence for the money, is what I can say. And to this day, I believe that's true. So that was my recruitment process. And it was strange, just one little addenda. In my final year in MI5, I was actually trained up to be a recruiter. The hippie skirt was not obligatory, by the way. And it was very interesting, because part of that training was to go through the whole process again. And I was there with some of the brightest and the best of the officers. And we all say, God, we can't do this anymore. Our brains have melted down because we've been in MI5 too long. So that was quite an interesting thing as well. That was in 1996. And that was the year when MI5, for the very first time, publicly advertised for recruits in the newspapers. In the past, they put obscure adverts in, like, Godot isn't coming, and people thought they were applying for journalism jobs and things like that. But in fact, it turned out to be MI5. That's how my former partner and colleague, David Shaler, got involved in MI5. But in 1996, they put open adverts. Would you like to be an intelligence officer? Would you like to serve your country? And I was in recruitment at that point. I was helping with recruitment on and off. And they got about 20,000 applicants, you would not believe, for 5 positions. And all the ones that wanted to be James Bond, they fancied the gadgets and the lifestyle and swanning around embassies drinking champagne, didn't get in. Now, of course, if you do want to be a spy, if any of you do by the end of this talk, all you do is go to their website, do a psychometric test, and off you go. Anyway, so I walked in January 1991, and we had only 2 weeks training, which was mainly how to write notes for file and briefings and things like that. And then we were posted to our first sections. And I was absolutely shocked to be told I was going to this little section called F2, which was the counter-subversion political section, which they had told me during the recruitment process they were stopping doing. So that was the first lie. Penny didn't quite drop then. I thought, okay, it's smaller than it used to be. But I was there for 2 years, and this gave me this incredibly in-depth view of the sheer scale of their work against British citizens for their political activities over the previous decades. It was astonishing. People could get files, as I said, for being a friend of a query sympathiser of someone in a group. And there were also notorious cases. For example, there was one young boy who was 14, he was at school, he was doing a project on communism. So he showed initiative, and he wrote a letter to the Communist Party HQ in the UK, saying, can you tell me a bit, please? I'm doing this project. He got a file in MI5 for that, which will still be there. And there was another case of a warring couple going through a very bitter divorce. And they both wrote letters to MI5 saying he and she are both communists. They got files. But there were ramifications. If you had an MI5 file and then wanted to go into certain types of work, you would be blocked, including journalism, sensitive journalism, including the civil service or tax or even accountancy in some cases. So that schoolboy would have been blocked from any of those careers if he'd fancied trying to apply to one of them. So this was a problem. The other thing that we saw when we were, both David and I were in F2 together, that's where we met. Our eyes met in a crowded office or something. And we were there in 1992, which was the year of a general election. Now then, MI5 was tasked to vet all people who might potentially become MPs. So anyone who stood as an MP had their name sent to MI5 and it was checked against their records. If they had a file, that file was pulled up and we in F2 had to review the file and write a report which would go to the head of the political party if that person were elected as an MP. So this was done to check if anyone was a national security threat. And if they were, they would be blocked from sensitive posts. And there was a cascade of files coming out at that point, mostly names that weren't terribly famous then, but became very notorious after the Labour landslide in 1997. So if you think about anyone who was anyone in Tony Blair's government from 97 to 2008 or whatever it was, pretty much anyone in the cabinet had an MI5 file. We're talking Tony Blair himself, Jack Straw, Peter Mandelson, Harriet Harman, Patricia Hewitt, the late Robin Cook, everybody. And this was a bit of a problem. One, because it's very much sort of case of the tail wagging the dog in a democracy. Because these men and women, men actually, all of them, went on to be the Home Secretary and the Foreign Secretary, i.e. the political masters of MI5, MI6 and GCHQ. They suspected that they might well have a file held on them, but they weren't allowed to see it, even though they were supposed to be in charge. And of course, then you get our MPs, who I'm sure one or two are entirely innocent, but most of them seem to have some information that they like to keep secret or private, or however you want to call it, be it expenses fiddling, or kiddie fiddling, or mistresses, or rent boys, or whatever it is. So you can imagine if they are trying to take on the head of MI5 or MI6, and they just get a significant look, they're going to start worrying about the information held on them, and not do their job of holding the spies to account. And I also think this goes some way to explaining why the Labour government of all governments gave so much power and resources and staff levels increased throughout the noughties to the spy agencies. They were falling over themselves to do the spies' bidding. Now the other interesting thing from this, of course, is that these politicians served under New Labour. So the idea that in the past they might possibly have been left-wing enough to have warranted being seen as a threat to national security by MI5 was deeply embarrassing for most of them. And there was a very interesting episode after the whistleblowing happened in '97, when David Shaler challenged Jack Straw, who was then the Home Secretary in charge of MI5, and he said, well, you know you've got a file, you can't see that file, so you have two options. Either you were really a threat to national security when this file was made, in which case, why the fuck are you the Home Secretary in charge of MI5? You should resign. Or you weren't a threat to national security, the file was opened wrongly on you. Therefore, how many other files have been wrongly opened on innocent people across the UK? He never answered that catch-22 question. Anyway, that was my first experience with MI5. That was lovely. You move on every 2 years to a new post. What I was employed to be was a general intelligence officer, which means that you are given targets to investigate, and then you have this array of different ways of investigating them, and then you get the information back from those different investigations, and then you make decisions on what to do, be it carry on investigating the target, arrest them, drop the investigation, whatever. And it's very strange because it doesn't take very long to get used to this, but the tools you have to investigate these people are very secret, of course. They are the interception of communications. Now, in those days, it tended to be telephones and letters. Remember letters? Snail mail. See someone sort of needling these letters open. Now, of course, it's all our electronic communications are just offered up to them. They can get a complete panoptic view of our lives. So that is one aspect. The other, of course, is putting bugs in people's homes, for example, property bugs, or bugs in people's cars or their workplaces to get the information they want. Or you can follow people around with mobile surveillance. This is this sort of people out on the street, you know, in teams following you everywhere you go. Or you can, if someone is a high priority target, try and put a human agent next to them or infiltrate the group that you're interested in. Now, humans, as it's called, is by far the most valuable type of intelligence that you can get, because people will be careful when they're using electronic communications. They'll be aware of potential spying. If they're really fly, they're really paranoid, They won't speak in their own homes, they won't speak in their cars, that sort of thing. Or even if they aren't, there might be a bug in one room and they walk out to another room and you lose the product. So human intelligence has always been the best, but has always been the most difficult to get and to manage and to keep the human agents safe. So actually, that's slightly wrong. I was an intelligence officer, I was not an agent running into groups. I was the sort of person who would be running these people or debriefing them. And I think this is a slight problem now that we're looking at this slide towards this sort of endemic electronic surveillance that we're all seeing, that Edward Snowden has exposed. Because this is very much an American approach to intelligence. They've always thrown tech at intelligence, because running human agents is a bit difficult, it's a bit subtle. And the Brits used to be much better at it, but it looks like over the last 15 years, they've gone much more in the direction of the US approach, and that's why we're seeing GCHQ prostituting itself to the NSA. Anyway, so I had two more postings, and so did David when we were in MI5. First of all, we moved to T Branch, which was the Irish terrorism section, and then we finished up in G Branch, which was international terrorism. Now, I won't dwell too long on the Irish side of things, but there are a couple of major operations which MI5 got wrong, where they could and should have stopped terrorist atrocities happening on the British mainland, and they didn't. But it's not only that they made a mistake, I mean, people do make mistakes. They refused to learn from them, and they lied to government to cover up their mistakes, so that, again, they could be made in the future. And again, this is one of the things that particularly concerned us, as well as the loss of life, as well as the atrocities, as well as the huge PR coup for the Irish terrorist groups by mounting these attacks and running rings around MI5 at that point on the UK mainland. Despite all this, it was the fact that MI5, one, was not only not up to its job, but two, then could lie about it. And the ministers had no idea they were being lied to. So if you ever see one of those stuffed shirts from Westminster standing up in the news now saying, oh, it's okay, I know exactly what they're doing, and they're all accountable to me, and they're doing a good job and they're following the law, just be aware that actually they don't really know what's going on behind the scenes. They have no way of getting that information, of forcing it out of the spy masters. But the third posting was the one that really threw up 3 cases of major concern to us. This was G Branch, the international terrorism section. And this is why we ended up taking the decision to resign, going to the media with our concerns, and then ending up going on the run and living in exile for 3 years. So the first case was an illegal telephone tap on a very prominent Guardian journalist. This was a woman called Victoria Britton, who was the diplomatic editor at the time. And she was involved in a libel case on behalf of a Nigerian diplomat. So he was sending quite large sums of money over to her so she could pay his lawyers in the UK. But MI5 got terribly excited about this. They said, oh look, she's money laundering for a query potential sympathiser of the Libyan regime. So they immediately swung into action and started bugging her phones to the nth degree. But they hadn't checked through open source intelligence, open source information, why she might potentially be helping this Nigerian. The fact that there was this huge libel case going on would have been a pretty clear indication that she wasn't actually trying to funnel money launder for the Libyan terrorist regime at that point. So by the definitions of the laws governing MI5 at that time, that operation was illegal. And David inherited it when he moved to G Branch, and then spent 6 months, I think, arguing this, and finally got the operation closed down. But it was worse than that. I mean, it was a gross invasion of privacy. And the operation itself cost, I think, the taxpayer about £750,000 for the time it ran. But they also then got even more excited because, hey, she works for The Guardian, she's a lefty, days, just like the good old days. And they decided they wanted to put a bug in her property, in her home, as well, to find out more vital information about her terrorist funding activities. So in order to run an operation like that, you get a crack team of specialists from MI5 to go in, break into the home, and plant the bugs. Now, in order to do that securely and not get caught out, what they do is they want to have, as they call it, all the key holders under control. So anyone who's got a key to that property who could go back and perhaps catch them in the middle of their bugging, say that carefully, has to be under surveillance and at a safe distance away from the house, so there can be no nasty returns, no nasty surprises. So they decided to do this. It was a big operation, and they were looking at where all the key holders were, and one was her daughter, who happened to be a theatre director at that time, working in a New York theatre. But obviously to MI5, the fact that she was in New York wasn't distance enough for this key holder from her mother's flat. So what they suggested to the Americans was to get her arrested by the FBI on trumped-up charges and held in a cell for 24 hours. Thankfully, reality prevailed and David managed to stop this egregious operation going ahead. But this is just to show their thinking, how paranoid they are, how overly insensitive to people's privacy, really, and to people's basic rights. The second case in G Branch was of, it was around the Israeli embassy bombing in London in 1994 in the summer. Now, this is an old case. Basically, the Israeli embassy is at Kensington Park Gardens, and a car bomb was driven up and parked outside and exploded. Now, it was a very strange investigation. There had been no indication that Israeli interests were under threat in the UK at that time. The threat level had not been raised. The bomb itself was incredibly sophisticated, so sophisticated that it actually ate itself, all the forensics, which even the IRA, at the height of its sophistication, couldn't manage to build. And there was a mysterious person who was involved, who got this car, and then who disappeared from the scene. And nobody had any idea about who might have planned to do this. Plus, the one other key factor that day was that all the senior embassy staff were magically out of the embassy at the time of the bombing, almost like they'd had a tip-off. The junior staff were allowed to sit in the building, but there were no fatalities, so that was okay. Anyway, so the Metropolitan Police Special Branch, MI5, didn't have a clue. They didn't know where to start looking. So they went out and sort of shook down the usual trees, which in those days tended to be Palestinian support networks based in London. And they scooped up a few suspects and interrogated them, and there was no evidence, and blah, blah, blah. And suddenly they managed to sort of piece together a really flimsy case against two young Palestinian engineering students. One was a young man called Jawed Botmeh, and the other was a young woman called Sama Alami. And they had cast iron alibis for the day of the attack, so they couldn't have carried it out. But they decided that there was enough flimsy evidence, enough circumstantial evidence, to get a conviction of conspiracy to cause this terrorist attack. So lo and behold, these two young students, about 20, 21, were put on trial at the Old Bailey, and vital intelligence was withheld by MI5, indicating their innocence from the trial. So inevitably, they were convicted, and they both got 15 years in prison each. They both served most of it as well. They were only released a few years ago. And this huge miscarriage of justice was just shocking. The fact that there were two key documents in MI5, and the most vital one being the official final report of the key lead investigating officer. He was a senior intelligence officer called codenamed G91. And his view, this is the gist of his official report, he'd seen all the police evidence and all the secret intelligence as well, was that Mossad, the Israeli intelligence agency, had carried out a controlled explosion outside their own embassy. Now, if you read that on the internet today, you'd be called a conspiracy theorist or a tinfoil hat wearer. Perhaps G91 was, who knows? However, he had seen all the evidence, and his thinking was, one, the Israelis had for the last previous 2 years been agitating for increased security and increased protection for all their interests across London. And MI5 kept saying, there's no intelligence, we're going to keep the threat level at moderate. We don't need to up it, there's no threat. So letting off a controlled explosion, which actually caused no major injuries, would have been a very good way of getting that result. The other key payoff for Mossad, it was assessed, would be that they shattered all these Palestinian support networks in London. Of course, just by scooping up a couple of innocents, everyone else just scattered, they ran for the hills, just when they were gaining traction politically. So that was of deep concern to us. Finally, before we take a break and have some time for questions, the case that made us quit. This is the reason why David and I resigned in 1996 and the story broke in 1997. Now, a little bit of detail. David had worked in G9, G Branch, for 2 years. He was the head of the Libyan section in G Branch. And he had developed an unusually close working relationship with his counterpart in MI6, a man called PT16B, if I remember rightly. Not quite as snappy as 007, is it? But that was his number. And I say it was an unusually friendly working relationship because normally the two agencies hate each other. I mean, they headbutt all the time. They're competing and treading on each other's toes. They're competing for resources. And of course, knowledge is power, so they like to keep their knowledge to themselves. But they got on, and they sensibly started having these bi-monthly meetings to discuss joint targets, to make sure that they didn't try and recruit the same agents, to make sure they didn't tread on each other's toes operationally. And it seemed to be going quite well, until in late 1995, PT16B rang up Dave and said, can you come over? There's something too sensitive to discuss on the telephone. This is like a top secret telephone, by the way. So David went over with his staff. PT16B was there with his staff. And he briefed Dave on an unfolding operation against the Libyan target. And then in a nutshell, there was a Libyan military intelligence officer who became codenamed Tunworth, who volunteered himself to MI6. He was what they call a walk-in. He'd gone to the British embassy in Tunis and said, can I speak to the local intelligence officer, please? And that's how you do it, by the way. MI6 is always based in embassies. So if you ever need an MI6 officer abroad, go to your embassy. So, of course, he did speak to the spook. And this relationship began to evolve because Tunworth was a senior military intelligence officer. And he said, I quote, he was heading up a ragtag group of Islamic extremists, and they were going to try and topple Gaddafi. But they wanted MI6 help to do this, including money to buy the equipment and the weaponry to carry out this attack. Now, initially, David was disbelieving. I mean, MI6 was always coming up with these sort of crackpot schemes, these James Bond wannabe schemes, and most of the time they didn't actually occur. However, MI6 was in a very tricky position at that point, because one of their key JIC priorities at that time was to try and get their hands on the two suspects for the Lockerbie bombing, Pan Am 103 that came down over Lockerbie in '88. And they kept failing. And the quid pro quo for this is if they helped Tunworth with his coup, Tunworth would hand over the two suspects for trial. So MI6 leapt at this offer from Tunworth. Obviously, as well, the other quid pro quo would have been letting our oil companies back into Libya, because of course they'd nationalised the Libyan oil wealth back in the 70s after the revolution. So this was seen as a sort of win-win. And MI6 ploughed on ahead with this, meeting Tunworth repeatedly over the course of a few months in various cities across Europe, and handing in bags of cash. So in total it was about $120,000 or so. And he went off and he bought his equipment and he bought his guns and he bought his explosives and he trained up his ragtag group of Islamic extremists, who by that point, by the way, everyone in the intelligence agencies knew meant Al-Qaeda, and MI5 had just set up a new group to investigate Al-Qaeda. So you've got MI6 funding a group that is being investigated by MI5. You can see how it works. Anyway, David was very concerned about this. He said to them, have you got authorization for this operation? Rolling back to the law I mentioned earlier, the Intelligence and Security Act 1994 governs MI6. This means that if MI6 wants to do anything which would otherwise be deemed to be illegal, if they get the prior written permission of the Foreign Secretary, they have indemnity. They cannot be prosecuted under British law for what they do. Now, MI6 lied to Dave at that point. They said, yes, it would go all the way to the top. But it turned out afterwards that actually they hadn't got that prior written permission. And just as a little historic artifact, the Foreign Secretary of that day was a man called Malcolm Rifkind, the very same Sir Malcolm Rifkind who heads up the Intelligence and Security Committee in Parliament, who now says that MI6 and GCHQ obey the law. He always disclaimed any knowledge of the Gaddafi plot. Obviously, MI6 hadn't got the prior written permission. So David was getting increasingly concerned about this and briefing his management up to the top, just saying, look, I'm not sure if this is going to, they might not do it, but we should be concerned about this. It's going to destabilise, if it goes ahead, it's going to destabilise an incredibly volatile part of the world. But they just said, shut up and don't rock the boat and just do what you're told, which was the standard management response in MI5 if you had ethical qualms. Anyway, David was hoping that it wouldn't go ahead. Unfortunately, it appears to have done so, because he was sitting at his desk in late February 1996, and suddenly these different intelligence reports came across his desk, saying there had been an attack against Gaddafi. What had happened was, he'd been at the Libyan People's Congress in Sirte, and he was driving back to Tripoli in a cavalcade of cars. And there were all the crowds waving and waving flags as he went past. And there'd been an explosion, obviously under a wrong car, because Gaddafi survived to be assassinated by the very same groups 3 years ago. But innocent people died in that explosion in the car, and innocent people died in the following security shootout that occurred as his guards converged to try and catch the attackers. It was estimated that 11 people died that day. So what we're looking at is MI6 funding a group that is already known to be an enemy, a target of British intelligence, to carry out an illegal operation which kills innocent people. How much more heinous can it get? This is why we decided to resign, because we couldn't change anything from within. Plus, we had quite high-profile reputations within MI5 at that point, both of us being quite maverick and outspoken about it. And still, we were just told to shut up, just follow orders. So this is why we decided to resign, and we decided to take our concerns to the media. And it took a long time for that process to start, but that's probably part 2. So, any questions so far? Yeah?
What's happening with David now?
He and I separated, sadly, in 2006. So I'm not really in contact with him at the moment. But some of you may be aware that a few years ago he came out to the world as the new incarnation of the Messiah. Which, of course, the intelligence agencies loved. Look, we always said he was a fantasist. So that was slightly unfortunate. I have to say, living through the stress of whistleblowing years, when you're either worshipped as a hero or hated as a traitor, and you're always broke and you're always paranoid and suspicious and things, it's impossible, it's virtually impossible to live through. So I just hope he's happy and safe in his new incarnation. He's better putting it. Yeah?
Might be skipping ahead, but how come you can talk freely now about these things?
Because of the Peter Wright spycatcher ruling, where the Spies tried to suppress the publication of his book, but it was published in America, it meant there was a court ruling in the UK that said if it's already out in the public domain, it can be repeated. So that's one thing. So a lot of this information came out during the whistleblowing years through the reports that David was writing, so it's public domain. And then in 2003, we wrote a book together called Spies, Lies and Whistleblowers, which it came out in my name, and I had to submit it to MI5 for clearance, otherwise I would be prosecuted. And they sat on it for about 18 months, which was really frustrating because it was the height of the Iraq War, and we wanted to be talking about all of these sort of things. But that book was very detailed. It covered all our concerns, all our disclosures in the public interest. So all that information has been cleared, so I can talk about it without being prosecuted now. Obviously, there's a whole wealth of other information which I won't talk about and I cannot talk about because they were successful operations. I'm not trying to say the spies are all bad. They do, a lot of good people go into the spy agencies to try and make a difference and work very hard to do so. The stuff that we went public about was purely what was in the public interest because things had gone wrong or they were illegal. So. My book is out of print, but I'm going to bring it out as an ebook, hopefully, if I get my arse and gear to do it next year. It's a bit out of date. Sorry, I think you were first.
Yeah. Just right now, how big do you think your file is in the office?
It'll be fatty, I think, now, yeah. In the old days, it was just this sort of nice, innocent little record of service. Now it'll be a personal file, a PDF. I should imagine if they're putting press and stuff on that too, it's going to be huge. The biggest file on record when we were there was actually 39 volumes of a PDF. I mean, I saw it once piled up on a senior manager's floor. It was like this high. And guess who that belonged to? Who do you think was public enemy #1 up to the 90s?
Harold Wilson.
Good guess. They didn't like him either. Arthur Scargill. And he was the only person who had his own unique recording category. So he wasn't a query, subversive, whatever. He was actually deemed to be an unaffiliated subversive. So he had his own recording category too. But yeah, that was the fattest file. I dread to think how much fun we hope it wouldn't be that fast. Yeah.
How much about what you did your family and friends know how you
Very little. Yeah, I mean, this is the other aspect, it's the sort of personal impact of working in the intelligence agencies. Even in the 1990s, it was opening up a bit. So we were allowed to tell our family and friends, very close friends, just a couple, where we worked, but we couldn't say what we were doing at all. And that was designed to provide a sort of cover if people started snooping around, and they could say, no, they work for the Ministry of Defence. But it is very strange because if you have old friends, you suddenly can't talk about your daily work, and the gap sort of develops. You know, they might want to know about their job or their love life or whatever it is, and you can't reciprocate, you can't discuss or share what your life is. And meeting new people becomes even harder because you have to say, and I kid you not, God, I used to hate this. If you were at a party or something, someone really, lovely came up and started chatting you up, and they would say, "What do you do?" I said, "Well, I'm a civil servant," and they'd be, "Go on." It's not cool. So yeah, you get this sort of gulf between your real you and how you have to be seen by the rest of the world, which is quite alienating. This also leads to a number of in-house relationships, should we say, which are not, because it's very difficult to stay with a partner who's not in the agencies, because you can't share anything, it's impossible. So there were a lot of relationships, both covert and overt. David's and mine was overt. I think they sort of quite approved of that, because of course it keeps all the secrets in-house. So that was odd. The other aspect of that was if you were involved in a success, and then you just saw a bit of it being reported in the news, the mainstream media, and you knew, it was like seeing the tip of an iceberg, and you knew the whole bottom of the iceberg. It was very surreal. You'd become quite disconnected with the real world and things. So it's strange, it's a strange life.
Was there like an official job that you could put in papers or anything?
An official...
Like another job that you could say you had? Or
Yeah, our cover was civil servant at the Ministry of Defence. Which is great until if you go to a party and there's a Ministry of Defence official there, that gets a bit tricky. Oh, who do you work for? Yes.
Do you think that the intelligence services should be reformed or dismantled and absorbed into the police, for example?
That will be part of the second half.
Oh.
I have some quite strong views on that one. So. Yes.
You mentioned about the recruitment process and what type of person you have to be, clear-headed and logical thinker. How do you think people that are in the service that committed these crimes and helped to commit these crimes became corrupted if they went through the same recruitment process?
Damn good question. Yes. How does some? They always look in terms of what they're looking for when they're recruiting you. They're looking for good judgment, analytical ability, teamwork, because you have to coordinate all these different resource teams all the time to run operations. Very powerful communication skills, both written and oral, so that you can gain people's trust if you need to, all that sort of stuff. But they do look for an ethical framework. So how does that get corrupted? Very, very good question. I think partly because there is no, you sign away your employment rights when you join. So there is no representation, there's no staff federation you can go to if there are any issues that you're concerned about. You're sort of on your own. So it becomes very easy for them then to tell you just to shut up and not rock the boat, just follow orders. And that means that if you continue to speak out, you are labelled a maverick. And many, many people did have very strong ethical concerns in the 1990s, and they then end up resigning. Not all of them end up going public, of course, but a lot of our peer group was resigning around the same time for precisely the same reasons. In fact, in 1996 alone, we lost 14 experienced intelligence officers because of all these issues and things going wrong. And normally the natural wastage would have been 2 or 3 a year. So things were going badly wrong, but they weren't curious about why so many people were flooding out. And they still have to keep recruiting apparently because they have retention issues, so I think it's the same. So that means you get all the awkward squad leaving, and you get the yes men and yes women staying in place. And they float up the management chain because it's sort of dead men's shoes virtually. And so you get this sort of closed groupthink mentality, a sort of self-perpetuating oligarchy, where there is a groupthink about a certain issue. And once, from the top, that's the position of the agency, then everyone else has got to obey or resign. And I think actually that goes some way to explain why now MI5 has got involved in torture cases again, as we know, because there have been some successful court cases about this. In the 90s, torture was completely off the books, partly for the ethical reasons, but mainly because in the early civil war in Northern Ireland, they had used torture and they had seen how counterproductive it was with the blowback. So in the 90s, torture was not possible. In the noughties, torture suddenly was possible. And I think that moral slide is partly because of this groupthink. There's not enough people to challenge the position of power on the inside. And once you've been in the service for over 5, 6, 7 years, certainly after 10 years, you become unemployable elsewhere. They've got you. So you've just got to keep on towing the party line. So I think that's how it can happen. It's this lack of ventilation, lack of outside scrutiny as well, and this sort of group thing. Start again now. Second half, which is going to be about what it's like to blow the whistle and go on the run, and looking at the current situation and with some suggestions potentially for the future, and how to survive the process. What can you do with your life after you've blown the whistle? So, going back to 1996, David and I resigned, and we'd already taken the decision that we would do something, that we would go public about our concerns with MI5. So he had copied some documents before we left MI5. And then he made contact with a journalist, bearing in mind this is the analog era, 1996, so there was very little access to the internet and things then. And through an intermediary, he met one of the journalists he would end up working with in a London pub in Soho. Now, at that point, there was mutual suspicion between the two, because the journalist was rightly concerned that MI5 might be trying to plant a fake story, because they do. David, of course, was terrified that the journalist might shop him to MI5 before any story appeared, and he would just be tried and convicted for a breach of the Official Secrets Act without having disclosed the information of wrongdoing. So they had this very sort of slow courtship between the two of them that went on for a period of 10 months. And it was very frustrating. But gradually the trust built up. Eventually David told him what his real name was. For the first number of months, I gather, the journalist knew him only as Mike from MI5. Don't know why I chose that one. And gradually the information began to be passed over. So it was very frustrating because we knew that it was going to happen at some point. And also we were beginning to suspect that MI5 knew something might be happening as well. There were little subtle indications that they were beginning to take an interest in us. So for example, in the summer of 1997, my father remarried and we went over to Guernsey, my home island, for the wedding. And we were stopped by a special branch as we landed in Guernsey. With no reason. I knew the laws. They were not entitled to question us without specific intelligence of suspected wrongdoing. So it looked like they'd been given a tip-off by MI5. And there were various other phone calls from former bosses, questions about a novel that David was writing, and things like that. He was indeed writing a novel, by the way, as well. It was a very good cover. So the pressure was ramping up. We were getting very, very paranoid about the fact that there might be that knock on the door one night, and we'd be taken off and held on remand. Eventually, the story broke in July 24th, 1997. And after all this waiting, and this increasing paranoia, whereby, for example, even in our own home, we were concerned that they'd placed a property bug in it, so anytime we ever wanted to talk about anything sensitive, we had to go outside. So the code for that, and this is where my social smoking suddenly took off into full-blown smoking, was let's go on the balcony for a cigarette. So I always blame MI5 for that habit as well. So finally, after all this waiting, all this tension, David got a phone call from the editor of the newspaper that ran the first story. It was the Mail on Sunday. Now this might sound like an unusual choice. Why didn't you go to the Guardian? Well, two reasons. The Guardian was very close to the new Labour administration at that point. And more crucially, the Mail Group was owned by a man called Viscount Rothermere. Now, Viscount Rothermere lived in exile in France, voluntary exile, and he was known to be incredibly antagonistic to the intelligence agencies who'd stiffed one of his best friends. So having the proprietor on your side was deemed to be quite a good thing. So David got this call from the editor on a Tuesday, can you come in? And then for the next 3 days, he just lived at the Mail on Sunday offices. They set aside a secure room. Nobody was allowed to know who he was, and they went through the key disclosures that eventually appeared in the newspaper. And then he came back at the end of that Tuesday afternoon and said, okay, the story's going to roll. It'll be next weekend. And I said, what, you mean next weekend or the weekend after? He said, no, the weekend after. We have 10 days. The next day he went back in to carry on working on this project and came back and told me, actually, no, the story is going to break this weekend. We had 3 days warning to get out of the country. Because we knew that by blowing the whistle, by going public, we'd have to become fugitives, we would be wanted people. We knew that our lives would be turned inside out. Any whistleblower from any sector has their lives turned inside out, be it someone coming out from the National Health Service, or the finance sector, or government, or whatever. They always go after the whistleblower and sack them, and you lose your career, and you lose your income, and potentially you lose everything else. But for intelligence whistleblowers, because of the Official Secrets Act, you also potentially lose your liberty. You are automatically criminalised under the terms of that act. So we had 3 days knowing that this was going to happen. And I spent those 3 days trying not to look suspicious. I mean, I was dying to clear out stuff from the flat, but in case I was being watched, I didn't want to look like anything was going on. And packing up, we just took 2 tiny bags. David said, oh, we might be gone for a few weeks, don't worry about it. In the end, we were gone for 3 years. And then on the story broke on Sunday, obviously it was the Mail on Sunday, and on Friday night I was running around booking everything using call boxes because I thought our telephone might be bugged. And I booked a cab to take me to a Heathrow hotel where I hoped David would come and join me that night. He wouldn't be arrested and intercepted. And I booked what felt like the last 2 airplane tickets out of the UK that weekend because it was a bank holiday weekend and everyone was sort of flooding over to Europe for some reason. So fortunately we got 2 tickets, a really red-eye early morning flight, and we had to leave the country on Saturday morning. I think we had to get up at 4 a.m. Actually a bit like this morning, that was fun. And get on our flight. And I was so paranoid about missing this flight, I think I set about 3 different alarm clocks and 3 different wake-up calls just to make sure we got up and got on the plane. And just even getting through the airport and getting through security was so tense in case someone had tipped them off. And it was only when the plane finally left the runway that we could relax for the first time in 10 months. It was just like, phew, we've done it, we're out of there. We flew to Amsterdam first, and then went and found this tiny little hotel in Utrecht, where we hid out for a few days. And then eventually the journalists who were working on the story came and joined us in the Netherlands. And we spent the rest of that week like something out of a bad spy novel, you know, driving around the badlands of the Netherlands, moving from hotel to hotel, trying to stay one step ahead of the people we knew were pursuing us. And then, of course, it was a good opportunity to use the skills of anti-surveillance that we had indeed learnt on the inside. So everything was paid in cash, nothing was booked over the phones, nothing was booked over central booking systems, and everything was done in fake names. And we knew, we found out afterwards how close they got to us, because we were staying in one hotel and they made it to our hotel the day we left. So that week was interesting. David, the first revelations that came out were actually some of the more low-level disclosures that he wanted to make. So it was stuff about files on politicians, files on pop groups, the illegal phone tap on Victoria, Britain. Crucially, what didn't come out at that point was the Gaddafi plot. And this was mainly because the newspaper realised it was such a huge story at that time that they wanted to do more research and stand it up. So basically, they bottled out of doing it, which was very frustrating because that's the key reason we had decided to go public. Anyway, after a week of doing this, we decided to get as far as we could out of the Netherlands as in one day. And in those days, and to be secure, I bought, I don't know if any of you have even seen one of these things, they used to be very good for interrailing. You get the Thomas Cook European timetable. So I was lugging this around with me, working out where we could go. The furthest we could get was travelling from the Hague all the way down through Paris down to Bayonne in the far southwest of France. So that's what we did on Saturday the 30th of August. And all that time, David was on the phone, the train phone, going over the stories and making sure the information was correct. And also we had some good news, because one of the things he'd factored in to what the government would do in response was to immediately injunct both him and the newspaper to prevent further disclosures being published. Now, that might sound like a weird thing to wish for, but he realised that if they did that, the whole of the rest of the media would then rally around the Mail on Sunday and say, how dare you censor us? We are the free press of the UK. And of course, that's exactly what the government and the spy agencies did that Saturday. So we got to Bayonne in the evening, about 8 o'clock. We were absolutely shattered after that week and found a little hotel. And I remember it vividly because it was on the river and there was a terrace and we sat there and we had a Keay Royale each and a bit of dinner and we just relaxed. Actually, it felt like we relaxed for the first time in 10 months. We felt we'd done it. The newspapers were all angry about the fact they'd been censored. We were going to be supported. There would be a push for an inquiry into the crimes of the spies and reform would happen. I remember the date very clearly because the next morning we woke up, slight hangovers as well, and the news dominating all the TV stations was that Princess Diana had died that day. Now everyone remembers where they were when they heard the news about Princess Di dying in the Paris car crash. We have particular reason to remember because we knew at that point we were lost. Because of course that story obliterated every other media story going at that time. It was the one thing we could not factor in to what we were doing by going public. We just found ourselves suddenly lost, on the run in Europe with no media protection. So that was a bit of a bummer, a bit of a downer. And we then spent the next month just sort of backpacking around Europe. It was a bit of a sort of surreal holiday in a way, knowing that MI5 were trying to trace us. So we were moving from hotel to hotel all the time, always paying in cash, changing our appearance, using fake names, that sort of thing. And of course, back in those days, it was all possible. Now, it would be so much harder with all the CCTV and electronic surveillance. I think, unless you're a sort of super geek like Edward Snowden, it would be damn impossible to do. During that time, the Metropolitan Police Special Branch went into our flat. They raided our home in London. We knew about that. And during that time, I knew that I needed to go back to the UK to sort out the flat, because at that point, I hadn't done anything. I was just David Shayler's girlfriend and a former spy. But I also knew that I would be arrested as soon as I went. So Liberty, the human rights organisation, by that point, was acting for us as our lawyer. It was headed up by a lovely guy called John Wadham at that time. And he flew out to Barcelona, I think we were at by then, to accompany me back to the UK. And he'd informed the police and MI5 that I was flying back and I would be willing to be questioned, go through the process. And I knew I'd be arrested. And he'd cut a deal so that, in fact, what would happen would be that he and I would go to Charing Cross Police Station in central London, which is the counter-terrorism police station. And I'd go through the questioning and that would be that. So it was a bit of a shock to fly in and be met at the immigration desk at Gatwick Airport by 6 burly police officers who arrested me and just drove me up to this place and interrogated me for the rest of the day. And it's really weird, I know this sounds really stupid, but to be in a room where there is no door handle on the inside of the door was the biggest job I think I'd ever had in my life up to that point. It was like, hey, this is really weird. But the interrogation was strange. There were 3 questionings. And I think the worst one was they had gone into our flat and they'd removed a lot of stuff. And they'd found some love letters we'd written. And that's the analogue era. And they were using them to read out to me to try and put pressure on me. It was very intrusive. Anyway, of course, I hadn't done anything by that point, so they had to let me go. But they kept me on what they call police bail, which means that you don't hand over any money, but you are required to answer the police station once a month or whatever terms they said. So that was great. That meant I was in the UK, I could go back to the flat and I could calm and help our traumatised families because they had known nothing about our plans. We couldn't tell them because we didn't want them to be at risk. We didn't trust our communications. And the first they all learned about it was reading the front page of the newspapers. So all the different stories from all of them were quite harrowing. They were so upset about what was going to happen to us particularly. And I went back to the flat and the sheer scale of what had happened to it was shocking as well. Because they had conducted a counter-terrorism style search, which means that they rip it apart. This is what they used to do when they were investigating the provisional IRA. So, for example, they pulled up floorboards, the carpets, they ripped the bath apart, they ripped out some of the pipes. How you would stash top secret documents in water pipes, I don't know. But they smashed a lot of furniture, and they also seem to have had a lot of fun in my underwear drawer. which was really icky because I remember going in and seeing all my knickers turned inside out and left on the floor. Anyway. And the really creepy thing was, of course, that the guys doing this, some of them were the people that I'd worked with. They'd been my drinking buddies and things. So it felt quite like a gross violation, you know. People say that if they're burgled. But this was state burglary. They took away bin bags of possessions. They even took away our bed sheets for some reason, which we never got back. But the one thing they didn't take, because there was nothing to find, was the only thing they were actually allowed to take under the terms of the warrant, which was any documents pertaining to the work of MI5. There was nothing. Anyway, they kept me on police bail for 6 months, so I had to keep going backwards and forwards from France to the UK to answer it. But it got worse because in coordinated dawn raids on a Monday morning, they went after Dave's brother and his 2 best friends on trumped-up charges. So they crashed into their homes at 7 a.m. on a Monday morning. And they were arrested and questioned, and again held on police bail for 6 months. So it was sort of, let's grab people, the people nearest and dearest to David, to put pressure on him, to keep him quiet, to keep him in his box, because if he doesn't, we're going to prosecute his loved ones. So that was a bit traumatic. I had about a week in London, packing up this flat, dealing with our families, and then I had an address to go and meet Dave in France. I didn't know where I was heading, just this mysterious coded message, get to this station at this time. Okay. So I got out of the UK, I was still allowed to travel, thank God, and arrived at this tiny little station called La Souterraine, which is near Limoges, right in the heart of France. And it's also the emptiest canton in France. There's nothing there. And he'd holed up in a little French farmhouse there. He'd found one, and it was really primitive. It was about half an hour's drive away from the station. And it was in a hamlet, tiny, tiny. I think there were 3 houses there. Our nearest village was a mile away, and our nearest town was 10 miles away. So this was remote, a very good place to hide out. But it was very primitive as well. So that was our new home for 10 months, all the way through the winter. And it was so primitive. I mean, there was no heating, we had an open fire. Sometimes we ran out of gas, so we had to cook on the fire. We had no television, we couldn't have a car because we couldn't register it. The only contact we had with the outside world was a computer on an old dial-up internet connection. So we were suddenly very cut off. And going from living in central London, in Pimlico, to that was, again, a huge shock, with nothing much to do. So what happened over those 10 months? Our lawyer, John Wadden, tried to negotiate with the government. He kept saying to them, look, Shayla's got much more evidence of much more serious criminality. Please take it and let him come back to the UK to give his evidence to you and, don't necessarily prosecute him. And they didn't want to do that. They just kept stringing us along and stringing us along. And at that point, the story about the Israeli embassy too, the 2 young Palestinians wrongfully convicted, came out in November that year because they submitted it under the terms of the injunction that had been taken out against David Shayla, which said if they submit a story and it's cleared, then the story could be published. And they allowed this one to go ahead, which was unusual. They redacted some bits. But they still wouldn't do anything about the Gaddafi plot, which was the key reason we quit. So eventually in frustration, David went back to the newspapers in the summer of 1998. He did an interview for Panorama. It was a big special on the Gaddafi plot. And he had the story come out in the Sunday Times and also the Mail on Sunday. So this was a huge story. And again, to use the terms of the injunction to make it legal, the newspapers submitted this story on a Friday afternoon. Now, of course, Friday afternoon, right at the beginning of the French holidays, there was nobody in Paris. And yet the bureaucrats swung into action. So rather than allowing this story to be published, they said, no, you're not allowed to, it's banned. But immediately afterwards, there was an urgent extradition request sent from Britain to France, saying that David Shayla was a traitor selling secrets to an enemy power, and they wanted to extradite him. So the French had to arrest him, had to go through the process. Fortunately, someone leaked the story of the Gaddafi plot to the New York Times. And fortunately, because of the spy catcher ruling, that meant it was in the public domain in America. So fortunately, then of course, all the UK media could pick it up and run with it. And this was in the summer of 1998, and the scandal was huge. There were calls for inquiries, there were calls for a reform of the Official Secrets Act, blah, blah, blah. But the government always refused to have an inquiry and always refused to take David's evidence. In the meantime, excuse me, he'd been arrested. In fact, he'd gone out and was coming back to the hotel so that we could go out and get some food. I was waiting for him at the hotel. And I got a phone call from him saying I'll be there in 5 minutes. So, just waiting there, and there's this knock on the door, and I think it's David. And I opened the door to see these 3 plainclothes policemen standing outside. And it's just that moment you've been treading for 2 years by that point, when you know something bad is about to happen. And they said they had Monsieur Shaler downstairs. They wanted his passport. Now, I knew the passport wasn't in the bedroom. But one of the things I did know was in the bedroom was his computer. So I'm sort of standing there trying desperately to block the view of the computer on the desk behind me so that they don't take it. And I said, well, are you arresting him? No, we're just taking him away for questioning. And that was that. I didn't see him again for 2 months. He disappeared into the French legal system. He was put in the Victorian prison, La Santé, along with a load of terrorists and people like Carlos Fujaco. And he was put under very stringent secrecy laws because the British had said he was a traitor. So he was put under something called mise au secret, which meant that nobody could see him apart from his lawyer. Eventually, the Brits finally coughed up the extradition paperwork after the maximum 40-day period, and the French saw what he was actually accused of, and they realised that actually he was a whistleblower. Now, under French law at that time, they deemed that to be a political offence, and they do not extradite people for political offences, which was precisely the advice we'd had, which is why precisely we'd ended up in France. But it took the French 40 days to get the information to realise the truth of the matter. And then, of course, you have to grind through the legal hearings and all the rest of it. So David spent almost 4 months in prison before the case was kicked out. The French refused to extradite him, which was fabulous. We had a hell of a party that night. And then we thought, well, there's no point going back to the farmhouse, that's blown. Let's just live more openly in Paris. So we found a little flat in Paris. And I have to say, if you're going to go on the run and live in exile, seriously recommend it. Although actually, Berlin seems to be the equal city for all the digital dissidents these days, and so that's pretty good too. So we had another 2 years there, which was rather lovely actually, in a surreal sort of way. It was the whole thing was very surreal, I keep using that word. And during that time, the Gaddafi plot was out, more information kept coming out, there was more pressure from the media to have a proper inquiry, to reform the spies, to build up some proper accountability. And during that time as well, we saw one of our former colleagues, a man called Justin White, bravely come out in our support. He went to the newspapers. His story was going to be the big front page splash on The Guardian. He basically said that he agreed with everything we said, and actually there were worse things that should be investigated. Now, coincidentally, that day, the memoirs of the former head of MI5, a woman called Dame Stella Remington, were leaked by the Cabinet Office, because she'd submitted them for clearance, to The Guardian. So that became The Guardian's big spy front page scoop, and Justin was relegated. If anyone says the spies cannot manipulate the media, all I can say is they are incredibly naive. There are other instances as well. During those 2 years we had living in France, first of all, there are a number of arrests. There was a journalist called Martin Bright, who was the Home Affairs editor at The Observer, who was very good on this subject, very good on the whistleblowing case. And he was threatened with prosecution and was only protected by the National Union of Journalists. There was another man who was the editor of Punch magazine, now defunct, and he was actually arrested and ended up with conviction for covering some of David's disclosures. But it got even more surreal as well, because there was a student activist called Julianne Davis. She was at Kingston University at the time, and she was involved in her student newspaper. So she had some oomph. She contacted David, and she said, "Can I come over to Paris and interview you?" And he said, "Yes, great." So they had a nice little lunch and a good interview, and she wrote it up and everything. And then she was sitting in a lecture theatre, much like this, one day, and suddenly all these big coppers come in and arrest her and drag her out of her lecture for a breach of, I kid you not, the Official Secrets Act 1911, which is there for treachery. It was a wrongful arrest, of course. She sued the pants off them. I don't know what they thought she had heard from David Shaler that would warrant something like that. But it was all an intimidation exercise, I think, to try and stop people reporting this information. Eventually, after 2 years, we realised we'd taken it as far as we could from abroad, that unless David went back, there was very little likelihood of an inquiry. So he returned to the UK voluntarily in the summer of 2000, knowing that he'd be arrested, knowing that he would be put on trial for a breach of the Official Secrets Act, but wanting to have his day in court so that the evidence of the Gaddafi plot would be read into the official record. Unfortunately, he was only ever charged with the very low-level disclosures from the very first newspaper reporting from 1997. The government played it very cleverly so that they didn't charge him with the Gaddafi plot, so that he couldn't raise it in court. And in fact, it got worse because we thought he'd be put on trial very quickly. After all, the police had had 3 years by that point to investigate the early disclosures. But they took us through a series of pre-trial hearings that went on for over 2 years. And every pre-trial hearing was investigating legal points, what David could or couldn't say when he got up in front of a jury. And all the rulings went against him, of course. And it meant that when he did come to trial in the Old Bailey, he wasn't allowed to say anything about why he'd done what he'd done, his motivation. He couldn't breathe a word about the Gaddafi plot because that would have been contempt of court. And in fact, there was a governmental super injunction in place for those 6 weeks of his trial, which meant that no media in the UK could mention the Gaddafi plot either. Even though it had been all over the media for the previous 3 years, it was airbrushed out of history during his court case, so that the jury could not be influenced by that. So it was a painful process to go through. Inevitably, he was convicted. He was facing at that point 6 years in prison for 3 counts of the breach of the Official Secrets Act. Luckily, he only got 6 months in the end. I was called to do a mitigation plea after he was found guilty, and that was the only time either of us throughout this entire legal process were able to say anything about our motivation, why we'd done what we'd done. The judge in his final verdict, his final ruling, said 3 key points. First of all, that David Shayler had done what he'd done in the public interest, that there was no financial motivation, and that no lives had ever been put at risk by his whistleblower. And I saw all the journalists writing it all down. So again, imagine my surprise the next day when I saw all the newspaper headlines saying precisely the opposite. Shayler sells agent lives down the river for money. It's like I'd been in a different courtroom to those journalists, which is quite an interesting process actually. It got me thinking very much about how the spies can control the media. But that's a whole different lecture I do generally to journalism courses. So of course he was convicted, and of course he went to prison, served his sentence, and paid his debt to society. And after that, we just didn't really know what to do. I mean, what do you do after you've blown the whistle on the spies? You become unemployable. I used to joke it was a bit like being a Victorian fallen woman, you know, where you take that irreversible step and can never go back into polite society. And that's what it felt like. So in the end, we wrote the book. It finally got published. And unfortunately, after all the stresses of all those years, and it was very intense experiences to live through, we ended up separating in 2006. And as I mentioned earlier, I think is safe and happy in his new life. So what do I do these days? One tries to rebuild a life after that. As I said, I am unemployable. No major organisation is going to want to employ me in case I do the same thing again. Plus, I wouldn't want to. It would be so frustrating to go back into a big organisation, see things go wrong, and knowing you couldn't do anything about it. It's a difficult position to be in. Most whistleblowers, and I know a lot of whistleblowers, find it very difficult to rebuild a life. I've been fortunate enough to have a website, which means that I do a lot of writing on a whole range of interrelated issues. That also means I end up doing a lot of research to back up what I'm saying, because most of it's usually fairly contentious. And that means as well, that gives me plenty of material. So I spend most of my life now as a writer, I think author, yes, Tinker author spy, and also as a public speaker and lecturer on a whole range of issues, which is incredibly fun because you get to travel all over the place and meet wonderful and interesting people. And then, of course, there's the media side of things. I get called upon, as Kieran mentioned in the introduction, to do a lot of media commentary, not only on intelligence, but a whole range of other things. Things like the war on terror, what's going on in Syria, what's going on in Russia, civil liberties. I sort of fell live into the hacktivist tech scene a few years ago as well, which was fascinating to me. So I also do a lot of talks at tech conferences, which of course dovetails particularly well now with the post-Snowden world. I've been talking about how the geek community can protect the wider society from the predations of the spies since 2007. But I felt a bit like Cassandra back then, because everyone was saying, oh, you're too paranoid, of course they won't do that, they're governed by laws, don't worry. Now, of course, post-Snowden, we all know quite how that is not the case, how rampantly the spies have been predating on all our communications and abusing the laws that are supposed to keep them under control. Now, I won't go too much into all the different details, but two key things from the Snowden disclosures, really jumped out at me. First of all was some of the GCHQ information, particularly the fact that GCHQ has been prostituting itself to the NSA. And I use that word advisedly. One of the early disclosures was the fact that they have received $100 million, at least, in funding over the last few years from the NSA to develop these intrusive programs. And they do it because they sell themselves to the NSA by saying, don't worry, we know you can't do these things because of the regulatory environment in the US. We have much more latitude in the UK, we can do what we want. Use us, give us some money, and we'll develop the stuff you need, which is precisely what they've done. And one of the things they developed was a program called Tempora. Now, this, I think, is one of the big shockers from the Snowden disclosure. This is the program that mainlines all the electronic communications from the transatlantic cables between America and Europe. And those come in to a main hub in the UK. And GCHQ can mainline all this information and then give it to the NSA. And our esteemed Foreign Secretary at the time, William Hague, and our wonderful former Foreign Secretary and Chair of the Intelligence and Security Committee, Sir Malcolm Rifkind, last year immediately came out and said, don't worry about Tempora. It's all covered by warrants. Our Foreign Secretary has authorised this, and he knows exactly what the spies are doing. However, he can't have known what the spies are doing because his warrants can only cover individuals or target groups. They cannot cover all the communications of an entire country. And actually what's worse is it certainly can't cover all the communications of an entire continent, which is what Tempora is doing. So it's not just the 60 million hapless souls in the UK that the Foreign Secretary is taking this decision for, although most of those hapless souls will probably say he wasn't elected to do it anyway, but that's a different story. He's actually taking it upon himself to sign a warrant to cover the 440 million other Europeans and have their privacy eroded. But it's all legal because he signed a warrant. The other thing as well, one of the issues that I get asked a lot is about privacy versus security. And just one key point I want to make about that is how private, if you want to have a long-distance relationship, you know, your boyfriend, your girlfriend, whatever is in a different country, and you want to stay in contact, do you ever use video conferencing calls, video Skype? Most of us do. I won't ask any of you to put your hands up, but have you ever heard a dirty video conferencing Skype thing? Because apparently a lot of people do. They have very intimate and explicit video chats with their loved ones. Up to 10% of all calls are apparently of that nature. And GCHQ is picking them up. And GCHQ staff are now getting counselling and guidance on how to overcome the trauma of seeing all these things. So the old adage, you know, oh, if you're doing nothing wrong, you've got nothing to hide, is bogus. You know, if you're in a consensual relationship, adult relationship, doing something like that, you are doing nothing wrong, but I'm damn sure most of you would want to keep it private. So this is a strange argument that keeps getting thrown back in our faces. That operation, by the way, is called Optic Nerve, which is a horrible name for an operation like that. So you have a situation. I would suggest that privacy is an absolute right. I think Hannigan, the new head of GCHQ, who tried to pretend it wasn't, is talking out of his backside. Because without privacy, the reason privacy is a basic right is enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. And the reason that was put in place was because the horrors of World War II were fresh in everyone's memories. They knew then how easy it was for countries to slide into totalitarianism, for police states to evolve, and for whole populations to be brutalised and cowed if they feel they might be under surveillance. That's why privacy is so vital. If we lose that privacy, we cannot, as citizens, have a private life. We cannot, as citizens, organise, become political citizens, push back against a government that's sliding towards a police state or totalitarianism. So if we lose our right to privacy, we lose our very democracy. And that is what we're facing. That is what Edward Snowden has shown. And just to finish, I would suggest that we cannot trust our spies not to abuse that. Because, of course, in the 1990s, and I say this advisedly, in the 1990s they were probably the marginally golden ethical decade of their 100-year existence, partly because they had been put on these new laws around the time I joined, and because it was pre-9/11 and the war on terror, which meant, of course, the intelligence gloves came off, they became very brutal again, they started torturing people and assassinating people and droning people, and now, of course, surveilling us all as well. So we're in a very difficult position, and we can't trust the spies not to use the power of the internet to abuse our rights. They had a golden opportunity in the 90s, when America found itself the one superpower standing, and America found itself to be the hub of the new burgeoning internet and the World Wide Web. So of course they pounced on it with great glee and developed means of surveying it. But what they didn't seem to argue or didn't seem to think through is, just because they could, does that mean they should? And that's the debate we need to go back to now. And just to finish, therefore, what it should be the role of intelligence agencies in the modern world, and how far should they go, and how far should they be controlled? Now, as I said, in the UK we have a very British, historically evolved model. It's a mess. And actually what they are there to do, even if they're doing their job appropriately, is to protect our national security and our economic well-being of the UK, not prostituting itself to put the needs of the NSA above the needs of our national security. But even that argument is difficult, because under UK law, the phrase national security has never been legally defined. So it can be much used and abused, it's very elastic. And it can be conflated very often, and indeed is, with the national interest, which then can be conflated, and very often indeed is, with the establishment interest. Like, cooperating with Gaddafi, getting oil contracts for their pals, it goes on, it's a mess. But again, that's a whole different talk. So we have a situation where we as a country, I would suggest, need to have that debate. What are the threats to national security now, realistically? And I can't see any. Because in World War II, we faced existential threats, yeah? Perhaps in the 70s, 80s, 90s, when the provisional IRA was operating at will on UK streets and bombing infrastructure, bombing government buildings, that's edging towards posing a threat to the integrity of the UK. But now, what are we facing? The war on terror, this nebulous war on terror. And no matter how grievous, no matter how shocking and traumatic a terrorist atrocity is, it is still a crime. It is not threatening the integrity of our nation. It's a horrible crime. It should be investigated and prosecuted as a crime by police. But what we have now is the intelligence community has got its claws so far into fighting the war on terror, but not doing it in an accountable way like the police have to, not doing it in a proportionate way, again, like the police should do, but at least they have some oversight, that we have gone sliding into what is effectively a police state now. So I would suggest we need that debate. First of all, go back to basics. What is national security? How do we what's the threat to it? How do we protect our country best against those threats? So my view would always be, we have this historic mess. Do we need it? If we're facing a new century with new threats and new capabilities, why not set up a new agency specifically to deal with terrorism? We can get the brightest and the best out of the three historic agencies, four agencies. We can give them new powers circumscribed by proper newly written laws, not analogue 20th century laws. And we can make sure that there is proper accountability, so that if they overstep their powers, they can be held accountable. It can be seen that they are acting in a proportionate manner within a democracy, not in the disproportionate and abusive manner they currently are. And finally, I suggest that we need an overhaul of the official secrecy laws, because we need whistleblowers. They are not going to stop coming forward, as we've seen. Despite what happened to Private Chelsea Manning, 35 years in prison, Edward Snowden still came forward. More will follow. Why should whistleblowers have to be automatically prosecuted and persecuted when they are doing public service? So to prevent that, rather than cracking down on them and investigating them and deeming them to be the insider threat, I would suggest we need a proper avenue, a proper channel they can go to with their concerns before they have to go public. And those concerns will be properly investigated, and if crimes have been convicted, those criminals will be prosecuted. And thereby, we have checks and balances put on the behaviour of our spies. That, I think, would be the way forward. That would be a mature approach to a very new world, the 21st century threats that we are indeed facing. Thank you very much.
slightly boring because I knew I should try it. Do you think that because they're that far into the network, that any sort of online presence is compromised? When they look at the Wired magazine operation to try and go undercover,
Yeah.
it's impossible to do, or it's impossible to actually hide from GCQ, etc. And so, do you sort of have an online presence which means you aren't compromised?
Totally, yeah. If you have an online presence, you are totally compromised. I will try very briefly to explain why. One of the other horrors that came out from Edward Snowden was announced actually at the CCC in Hamburg. I think someone was there. And this was where he disclosed that all hardware that has been made since 2008 is compromised. It has inbuilt backtrap doors and things like that. So not just your computers, but your phones. Not just that, but even USB cables that can go in and charge these devices. So it doesn't matter how careful we are in protecting ourselves against compromised software, such as Microsoft or Apple stuff or any of the social media. The hardware as well, potentially, is compromised. Now, that means that at the moment there is a ragingly hot second-hand computer sales market across Europe. And the best one, I've got one, it's great. The best one you can get is a little IBM ThinkPad from 2007, I can't remember the model, X something, and strip out all the communication stuff from it. And also then use open source software, use anonymized Tor web browsing, Tor, the Onion router, set up the whole system from Tails. And if you think this sounds hideous, hideously technical it is, so I don't even want to begin to try and explain any of it at this point. But there is information on my website if you want to have a look about some of the basic steps you can take. And if you go to my website, by the way, it's custom built with all the security ideas in place, which means that I value your privacy so that you will not be tracked for looking at my website. There will be no cookies, there will be no spy stuff coming out of my website, so you'll be safe. But yes, you need to think, if you're on social media, you're screwed anyway. I mean, Facebook is the spy's wet dream because you're providing and giving it up for free. All the information they used to have to try and spend months investigating on you, what your views are, where you live, who your friends are, who you're dating, what your political ideas are, what films you like, everything. You're just giving it to them. I always reckoned Facebook was like a paedophile grooming a child. There's groomed whole generations now to just offer themselves up live to the spies. It's sick. So yes, social media is bad. I use it judiciously, but I don't put personal stuff out there. But yes, it's the software and moving away from that sort of ease and dependency on corporate software, particularly from the US, and also having more thoughts about the hardware as well, if you want to get really paranoid. You want to be really, really, really paranoid. The only secure way you can communicate with another human being, you get a piece of glass, one sheet of paper, you cover it up and go under the cover and you write. And then you shove your friend under the cover so they can read it. And then you rip it up under the cover, and then you burn it, and then you mash up the dust, and then you scatter it. Because that way, there will be no impression on the glass or the ceramic. There will be an impression on everything else. If there's only one piece of paper, there will be no paper underneath it to leave an impression on. Nobody can hear anything because you're not saying anything, and nothing can see what you've written. It's true. It's handy hint for tonight. Yeah.
This is my question, but have you used that method yourself?
Yes, I have used that method myself. During the whistleblowing years, when David and I were really paranoid, that's when we were using it. And you feel like you're going mad because you think you have to use it. And also when I was arrested and sitting in this counter-terrorism suite in Charing Cross Police Station with my lawyer John Wadham, video cameras up there, and of course they weren't on, they told us. And, there's no recording devices in here. Yeah, right. We knew that it recorded interviews, privileged conversations with lawyers. So again, I'm sort of writing like this and keeping it really secret and not saying anything to John. And I think he thought I was this sort of paranoid fruitcake. But I was right to be. Yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering on your thoughts on the UK in general sliding down kind of more of a crackdown on legitimate dissent as more like opposed to like what you would call illegitimate, but even legitimate protests, movements, especially after the London riots, police and government force is used excessively to crack down on them, to control them, and it's all done in the kind of as an excuse of public safety and keeping the public peace and whatnot.
Yeah. There's a question about their investigation into legitimate dissent, activism and things. Absolutely, you're absolutely right there. They are completely out of control on that. And even though MI5 gave up investigating subversives in 1995, they handed off the responsibility to the Metropolitan Police Special Branch. And some of you may be aware of the Undercover Cop Scandal, where there's a section called SDS. In fact, we in F2 used to have to work with them sometimes. These were the Harries, as they were called. These were cops who went undercover into activist groups and lived the lifestyle for 2, 3, 4 years and reported back on these groups. And this, at the time, took on the responsibility in 1995 and then no longer was employed, no longer part of the Metropolitan Police. They were hived off to an organisation called ACPO, the Association of Chief Police Officers, which is actually a private company. So these secret police were working for a private company with no accountability from the police, normal police procedures. And they were still penetrating these groups, and I don't want to be flippant, but literally penetrating a lot of the activists as well, because they were having affairs with these poor women, even fathering children on these unsuspecting women, then just vanishing. So of course, they are pushing for recognition and recompense for the trauma of this. So this has been going on up until at least 2010, and we know that because of the scandal breaking. The other aspect that most people are less aware of is the explosion in mercenary spy agencies. These are the corporate spies. Companies like Kroll or Diligence or Aegis, particularly in the UK, tend to be staffed by former spooks. And they go around and they're for hire. So companies like British Aerospace or weapons companies or Heathrow Airport or something like that, or anti-environmental sort of corporations, will employ these corporate spies to go and investigate activist groups, particularly single-issue activist groups. There's been estimates that if you go on a big demo against one particular subject or something, there might be as many as 1 in 4 people there might be corporate spies. So they are running amok, and it is not appropriate in a democracy, because again, if you start, you're not just thinking about, I might be being bugged, my communications, but someone in this room might be a spy reporting back on us. You stop communicating freely again. You stop sharing your ideas, you self-censor. And again, that is the start of the slide towards the police state, which is why very early on this evening, I drew the equivalence between MI5 and the Stasi, the East German secret police. Because this is what they have been doing for years. And this is what the spy infrastructure seems to continue to be doing in the UK, actually at a greater and greater pace. So just finally, one comment on that is, on the anniversary of Edward Snowden's disclosures this year, a special magical secrecy tour was organised in Berlin, and I spoke at it, and we went round on this bus. It was great. And they took us to the Stasi HQ, which is now a museum. And it was really freaky walking in there, because, of course, it was closed in 1990, and I started working in 1991 in MI5, and I walked in there, and it looked exactly the same. Even the tech, it was like stepping back in time to my very first posting there. But obviously the scale of their penetration of the society was vaster. But actually the sort of activities our spies are getting involved in now with the electronic surveillance is equally, if not more, intrusive.
The whole communication, the whole transfer of the communication is a massive flow. How can they ever manage to filter anything out?
They've got the computers to do it. The capability is so, it took them a while to catch up in the 90s, I think, in terms of how they could grab all this information. But now it's just like they're sucking on a fire hydrant and they're grabbing everything because they can. And then they've got all these algorithms and things to weed through. But it's not so much the fact that they're getting it, it's the fact that how long are they going to store it, I think is the problem. Because they've just built this new supercomputer city in Utah in the States, this new NSA super city, where they have the capacity to store all the world's communications for years. So again, you might be doing something this year where you think, I'm an activist, I'm going down to the Occupy camp or something. I'm going to wave a placard. I'm doing nothing wrong, I'm exercising my right to freedom of expression as an active citizen of my country, which is a democracy, right? And then all this information on you is stored. What if, and it's not inconceivable, we have many lessons from history, the laws change. What if suddenly Occupy is deemed to be a domestic extremist group or even a terrorist group. And suddenly your past comes back to bite you. Suddenly you can be investigated as a domestic extremist or a terrorist. And we all know how terrorists are investigated these days. So there's sort of issues we need to think about. The storage of this information is just as dangerous, if not more so, than the collection. And if you think that comment about Occupy sounds fanciful, when the camp was being held down in the City of London a few years ago, there was a letter written by the City of London police to all the local banks, which was leaked, which actually did say they deemed Occupy to be domestic extremist / terrorist group. So it's already happened in the UK. Any other questions? There's one over there somewhere, I think. Yeah.
Yes, I was just wondering, what kind of material do you think is the most sensitive? Is for us as individuals likely to cause trouble in the future if we put it online, for example? How can we prevent, you know, if we use social media, then how can we do something against that, the stuff that we, the way we use the media is not going to cause harm to us in the future?
Yeah, I think there are certain ways you can be more secure with social media. I mean, how can anyone survive without social media? I mean, I'm a complete Twitter addict, for example. But it depends what you want to put out there, assuming that once it's up, it's going to be there forever, it will be picked up, and it can be used against you. So, for example, I put nothing personal on my social media now. I use it more as an alternative news feed. So, you know, particularly with Twitter, if you follow interesting people, you get news from around the world on interesting subjects. So that's great. If I want to have more private communication with someone, that's when I will start using PGP encryption for my emails. I will insist on it. That might not be perfect because, of course, the hardware might be compromised or whatever, but at least you can take steps and start people thinking about why privacy is important and what they can do to protect it. And it's not necessarily that easy to install, but there are these things called crypto parties, which started a few years ago. Voluntary parties where socially minded geeks will offer their services to people who want to take their laptops along to get protected. And these things have just exploded around the world because people are very concerned about these issues now, post Snowden. So that's one way of getting teched up, or you know, hug your friendly geek or something. So yes, in terms of personal relationships, anything you just think is private, or if you're organising something like a demo or something like that, don't do it on social media. Only use social media for publicising things, not for planning. Don't give away your strategy. Yeah.
You compare British intelligence to Stasi, but at the same time, you said that British intelligence does not really have that many threats at the moment. And I wanted to ask, since Stasi did have threats, and to their great idea of socialism or whatever they were building, what do you think, true interests British intelligence services are protecting?
Today in the UK.
Are they working for themselves? Are they working for what are they doing all this for?
Good question. Who do the intelligence services work for? Well, they're supposed to work for we the people, obviously. But they're just sort of historically entrenched now. It's jobs for the boys. So no matter what threat goes away, they will always find a new area of work for them. So, for example, the Cold War ended, they took over terrorism. Then the Irish peace accords were signed, so suddenly they lost that work again. So suddenly they found, let's help the police on organised crime work. And they did that for a year or two. And then suddenly, Al-Qaeda got their attention. They said, we can do Al-Qaeda, fantastic. Police, you have organised crime back. So there will always be work for them. In terms of who they work for, particularly MI6 is very embedded within the establishment. There's a sort of revolving doors culture between top civil servants and senior spies and top businessmen. So they tend to conflate their business interests or their class interests with the national interest and with national security. So it's always become a sort of establishment private security firm to protect themselves. And I think one of the things they are putting in place is the potential for more civil unrest if the economy gets worse or there's war with Russia or whatever it is, so they can crack down on we the people. But also they can protect their own commercial interests, particularly sort of the global elite, globalized corporation interests as well. I think that's something, there was one episode, I'm trying to think back now, there was a case of a Libyan dissident called Abdel Hakim Belhaj, who was captured and sent to Libya, to Colonel Gaddafi in 2004 to be tortured. And he was captured by MI6 and offered to Gaddafi as a present, because Gaddafi now was the new best friend of the West at that point. And he wanted Belhaj for years. Belhaj was in prison for 6 years and tortured, 7 years and tortured. Of course, after the overthrow of Gaddafi, all the paperwork came out, all the information came out about this. So he's now suing Jack Straw and MI6, and also a man called Sir Mark Allen, for his torture. And he's not doing it for money. And they tried to stop this case going into open court. They wanted a secret hearing. He's now won the right to have it in open court too, which is great. He doesn't want money. Well, he does. He said he wanted £1 from each of the 3 people. But what he wanted was a full apology and acceptance of their responsibility for what happened to him. I think it's a great thing to do, so watch that space. The reason I mention it is the third party he's trying to prosecute is a man called Sir Mark Allen. Now, he was the former counter-terrorism chief in MI6, and then he left and immediately went to work for British Petroleum as a senior position. And he was the one who brokered this deal to get Belhaj and give him as a gift. And because of this, BP suddenly got a lot of nice juicy oil contracts. So you can see the connectivity tends to be at a higher level. And it's very corrupt, I think.
Okay, we will take 2 more questions before we will wrap up.
Who hasn't asked questions? Go right at the back.
Before a question, I want to mention there's a group in Aberdeen called 57 North that will tell you everything you want to know about PTP and the different parties and all
Excellent.
that. My question is, in Europe and the US, or let's say the Western world, which country has got the best legislation? Who should we aspire to protect the citizens? Who's got the best legal system, let's say, to...
Yes. Nobody by the looks of it at the moment. When David and I were thinking about where to flee to with greatest protections, it was France and the US, ideally, strangely enough, in 1997. Now, of course, no right-minded whistleblower goes within 1,000 miles of the US. I think, and also Germany is attractive to digital dissidents because they have had historic experiences and did put a good constitution in place. And France was good. But unfortunately, we've seen in all these countries that it doesn't matter what the laws are, how good the laws are, the spies will ignore them anyway. So this is the key problem. Even if post-Snowden, the European Parliament brings in new protections and new laws, we can't trust the spies to obey them. And we have no way of overseeing that they are obeying them. So that is the key problem. And this is why I think it's still worth trying to work through the established legal systems and the established political systems to change the law. In fact, I was one of the whistleblowers who gave evidence to the European Parliament last year for that very reason. However, we can't trust our governments to change the laws properly because they don't understand what they're talking about. We can't trust the spies to obey the laws. So that's why I suggest we take our privacy into our own hands with crypto parties and things like that. So it's a sort of two-pronged thing. It's the tech response, which we have to do as individuals, and then the sort of democratic response, which is a good thing to try, but probably won't work. One of the 2 countries, there are 2 countries actually which are a bit better, is Iceland, because they seem to be gone really radical recently. They are putting in various measures to guard against the predations of the spies and protect whistleblowers. And Norway seems very good as well. Very transparent, very flat organisations. So I think it was very telling. You remember after the Breivik shootings, that appalling terrorist attack, their response was very, very different to most other Western countries. They said, we're not going to let this change our way of life. We are going to be open and remain open. And we will mourn, but we're not going to be acting as barbarians. So I think Norway's quite good too. One final question.
You talked about how the media is sort of affected by the government and influenced, and as a politics student, I think it's very difficult to know how much can you trust the media and to what extent are the stories true or not true and adapted to sort of to the policies or the better for the markets or corporations. And what's your view on this? And how much can you trust it really?
I don't very much at all, actually. My best advice is just to read as widely as you can. So every morning I still read the Daily Mail online, I still read the Guardian online. And it's interesting comparing the same stories they cover and how they differ. And it's also very interesting seeing which stories they ignore, each of them. But yeah, read widely. I mean, there's many alternative sources. I mean, RT is very good on America and Western Europe. but of course it never mentions anything about Russia. So other TV companies would be very good on Russia, but they'd be crap about themselves. So it's just trying to get that balance. One thing you need to be aware of, there's a sort of, in terms of how the media is controlled in this country, there's the soft power, which is the induction of journalists into the spy secret circles. They get their briefings, they become dependent. And also the internet connectivity between proprietors and editors and top government people and top spies, which of course has all been made there as well with the hacking scandal. And then there's a whole raft of laws that can be used to stop proper investigative journalism. Terror laws, injunctions, PIIs, libel actions, the Official Secrets Act. In the UK, a journalist can be prosecuted under Section 5 and face 2 years in prison if they cause damage by covering a whistleblower story. Now, even in Russia, the journalist will not be imprisoned for covering a whistleblower. Only the whistleblower will go to prison. Well, mind you, in Russia, some of the journalists will be shot. So there's all this, and the one final key point on this is that MI6 certainly in the 90s had a section called IOPS, Information Operations, and this was there specifically to place fake stories in the media about intelligence, or for other nefarious reasons, and also to massage and spin what could be potentially damaging stories about them in the media. Now, I'm sure it's not called IOPS anymore, but I'm sure something like that still exists.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Annie, for this
My
really
pleasure.
good talk.